from stealing. Those are the things that we thought were really mean things to do for Halloween. So that's what it was. We had good, clean fun. They would flood the playground, and we go ice skating in the winter. And at churches, we'd have great big summer picnics out in Washington Park. So it was just a family community.
What are some of the biggest challenges you faced growing up in the Woodlawn community?
What was some of the what?
The biggest challenges you faced growing up in the Woodlawn community.
Challenges? I don't know if this should, some people will probably get angry with me, but there was it was a color code. There were, and it seems it comes back from the days of slavery. There were those among us in Woodlawn, there were sort of a clique. Those who were very fair and looked European. In fact, some of them passed and had much better jobs than the other African Americans because they could pass. You would see them in department stores where we weren't allowed to work. Some of them were teaching in better schools in the community because they thought they were not colored teachers. When you were dating, the prettier girls, the fairer girls got the better dates. And somehow they were made aware of this. You were made aware of this when we were growing up. And I think that was, some people it haunted them. In this book that we wrote, there was one lady who wrote about how this had affected her. And it didn't make any difference if you were well educated, you were well mannered, it was based in a lot of instances on the lack of pigmentation in your skin. And I think that left a harshness and a feeling of insecurity in some people. I remember that, and when I hear people making distinctions today about whether someone is fairer than the other, it reminds me of those days growing up.
Are there any incidents and examples of discrimination or racial bias that you can share?
This is an interesting story. One summer, I had a job working in the Loop. When we got out of high school, during the summer, we automatically had to look for a job because the money wasn't there. You just automatically went looking for a summer job. That was just part of being a young person. The first job I had was working at a little ice cream parlor on the corner. And I would get $10 a week, and I worked from noon to 4 o'clock, and I would sell the ice cream cones to the children in the neighborhood. And I would take my $10 home to my mother. I worked all of that summer, so I had $80, which meant I was super rich. And so we went downtown and bought me a coat and things, to go back to school. So when I got into high school, I couldn't get a job, and my mother's friend's daughter, who had gone to boarding school with my mother, said that, would I mind working in the Loop? And I was happy to get a job anywhere. So I got a job working for this advertising company at 333 North Michigan. The building's still there. I was a messenger girl. It was an advertising company, and I had to take their art pieces to different places in the Loop. I would pick up tickets at the train station for some of the members who would travel back and forth across the country. There was a little coffee shop in the lobby. The counter wasn't any bigger than that table. And they had where you could see people, and they sold sandwiches this was in the 40s. A sandwich and a cup of soup was 25 cents, and you could get a sweet roll with a cup of coffee or tea for 15 cents. One day, I had come from the Art Institute. They let me work after I completed that summer They knew I was a student there, so they said, would you like to work part-time? And I said, yes, so I would walk from the Art Institute up to this advertising company on Michigan. Now, Mr. Prince, as I told you, there was the color thing in my community. He worked for Argo Starch Company, and he looked as white as any person that you would know. His children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. I was down there, went down to get a sandwich because I had come from school, and when I turned around, there were these 3 men seated at the counter, one of whom was my neighbor, whom I'd known since I was 5, was Mr. Prince. And I could see the red wailing up in his face. And I just took my little sandwich and went on up to the 22nd floor is where I worked. And when I got home that evening, I said, Mom, guess who I saw at work today? And she said, whom? I said, Mr. Prince. And the first thing out of her mouth was this: did you speak to him? And I said, no. When he died, his wife had to get a lawyer in order to get her widow's benefits because they said he had falsified his application for the job. He didn't falsify his application. He just went there and they just assumed that he was the person that he was.
Do you feel the community was stronger and more cohesive than it is today?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Some of the people that grew up in that community were unbelievable. There were 5 Tuskegee Airmen that came out of Woodlawn. If Mr. Lucas had come here and asked, he would have had some really true stories of real, you know who the Tuskegee Airmen are, don't you? Did you say no?
I say yes.
I can't hear you.
I say yeah.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. Because a lot of people really weren't aware of whom they were. There was George Bates, who died training. There was Hannibal Cox. There was Judge Carroll. There was Ronell Bright's brother. They were all Tuskegee Airmen. And Sammy Rainier's a mortician. His son was a Tuskegee Airman, and they all grew up in Woodlawn.
What are the different types of jobs you had?
When in Woodlawn, when I was growing up, in general, most of the people, this was how it worked. There were postal employees. They had good jobs that had futures. There were the teachers. There were a few doctors, but most of them were domestics, or they worked for the railroad company, or like my father had his ice business. There were some entrepreneurs who had stores and things. But most of the time when we looked for jobs, there was a hall printing company that hired a lot of people. And there was another company, they used to sell clothes. What is the name of it? They were on 35th Street. Spiegel's. A lot of people worked at Spiegel's because they sold through catalogs. And those were the jobs, those are basically the types of jobs, unless you went to college. And most of the people who went to college in Woodlawn, when I was growing up, some of those who were passing, they went to historical black colleges: Fisk, Howard, Wilberforce, Tuskegee. And once those young people were educated, some of them couldn't get jobs in the field that they had been trained, but they could get jobs as social workers and worked in government positions. So that is what happened to those that I knew, that I grew up with. One of my neighbors became the first substitute teacher, and as years went on, they all, they moved up into the financial world.
That's all I got for
I hope I covered more than everything. Because he was passing.
Oh, because you didn't want to out him? You didn't want to out him?
No. He was passing. And I known him. Can you imagine how that was? Here's somebody I known since I was 5 years old, lived down the street from him, but we all knew that he was working for Argo Starch. Black folks didn't work in a CEO position for Argo Starch. At that time, remember, these were in the 40s and 50s. And when I saw him sitting there at the counter, and all the people he was seated with were white, so I knew that these were, you know, that these were people in the field that he worked. So I wasn't going to speak to him. That shows you the mentality. Because there were people in the building that I worked with that were white. I'd get on the elevators and I'd speak to them. But you did not speak to someone that you knew was passing. Because that's the way it was. There were ladies that worked at the department stores that were in my neighborhood. When you saw them in the department stores, you never acknowledged them unless they acknowledged you, because everybody knew they were passing. You never heard of passing before. You never heard of that? That's interesting. That's interesting. Let me say this. There was Parker High School on 60, Parker High School. We lived in Woodlawn. We couldn't go to Parker High School. We had to go all the way to Englewood High School. But there were people that lived in my community who looked like they weren't African American or colored. They went to Parker High School. People did that because they could get, what was one of the reasons they would pass? They could get better jobs. They could get a better education. We didn't fault them. If we faulted them, we would have